All right, everybody, welcome. It's good to see you this evening. As most of you know, I'm Ben Powell, and I direct the Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech University, and we sponsor this lecture series every semester. And I'm thrilled with what we have to do tonight. But before I introduce tonight's speaker and get the program started, I will just say, I'm not sure I'll say next up. Next scheduled as of right now this semester is on May 4th to visit with former Senator Phil Gramm on his book that he wrote, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. We did have another event scheduled earlier this semester that got postponed, and we're working on rescheduling that for somewhere in between these two, so hopefully there'll be an announcement that comes out on that later. But otherwise, this is what's next up. But first, tonight, I am thrilled that we have Professor James Heckman with us, and we're doing this a little bit differently tonight, and partly it's because he and I were trading emails about what topic he wanted to talk about, and there were like 3 or 4 that went back and forth that I thought were pretty good, and I said, well, let's just have a discussion, and we can touch on all of those and some other things. So we're going to have a kind of fireside chat here tonight. I'll ask him a series of questions about a number of different related, semi-related, or not related topics, but all related to his work in economics more broadly. And I'll make sure to stop asking my questions in time to give you all time at the end to ask questions of him as well. So James Heckman is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and the Director of the Center for the Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. He earned his bachelor's degree in mathematics from Colorado College and his MA and PhD in economics from Princeton University. He's been on the faculty at the University of Chicago since 1973. Professor Heckman is the author of nearly 400 peer-reviewed journal articles and the author or editor of 9 different books. His work has been cited by other scholars more than 280,000 times. For those of you professors in the room who like checking your Google Scholar page and seeing how many new citations you're getting, he has received 1,164 since January 1st of this year. And that was as of this morning. I'm sure something else happened today. His research focuses on policies that reduce inequality and support skill development across the life course. Current work includes evaluating early childhood programs and their long-term effects on health, socio-motivational development, well-being, and intergenerational outcomes. Related projects develop new methods to measure character skills and economic performance to inform education and social policy. He won the John Bates Clark Medal from the American Economics Association in 1983. That award recognizes the American economist under the age of 40 who is judged to have made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. He received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2000 for his pioneering methods to evaluate social programs and account for selection bias in policy research. Please join me in welcoming Professor Heckman here at Texas Tech.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I've already had several good discussions, so I'm sure this will be a good one.
I actually had to tear them away from our PhD fellows in a small seminar room to get them over here in time to start, which was great. So let's start with talking about inequality and development here in America as it relates to some of your work. What do you maybe start by reflecting on like broader causes of inequality and barriers in the United States?
Well, there's a lot of discussion. You're having Phil Gramm here, so he'll elaborate on these questions in terms of measurement. But one major source of inequality, which people don't discuss very much, is the family and the result of family and family institutions. If you look at the way poverty is actually measured, you'll actually see that there's a lot of poverty is concentrated in single-parent families, and those single-parent families are major contributors, just from a purely statistical point of view. A lot of people living alone, say with a child or two, those people are major contributors to the overall poverty statistics. And the whole discussion of the family has been kept outside of a lot of the public policy discussions. It's a very sensitive area for many people, but I think it's a neglected area for understanding poverty and for understanding solutions to poverty and trying to upgrade or uplift people who may be in poverty. So I think we undervalue this institution and don't approach it in a proper way in doing public policy.
So actually then, maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit of how well do most welfare or job training programs get at addressing poverty and its root causes in the United States, and why do they work or not work?
Well, this is something I work on a lot. It's kind of led me to where my current research is, but I spent quite a bit of time. As a labor economist, I've done a lot of work on job training programs over the years, written many papers on them. And the results are not very good, except for a small group of people. Women who were initially, when forced out of high school, and they were pregnant and they had children and they had to drop out, and then wanted to re-enter the labor force, these job training programs had a beneficial effect. They really did. They were an avenue for re-entry. But if you start looking at the effects of most of these studies, and these are for adult workers and for teenage workers and for a number of people across the board, it isn't just one group of people, that what you found was that they had a very minimal impact on terms of adjusting people, allowing people to. There's a lot of discussion now about saying, okay, because of AI or automation or robots or various kinds of causes, that we should have a lot of re-emphasis on job training programs. But job training programs have generally been very ineffective in terms of design and not an easy way. Partly because they're so superficial. They're actually 2 or 3 months, put people in a program, you're not really teaching them any basic skills. And frequently they were put in a way that it wasn't really adapted to what the market was. And many of the people in the programs, remember I studied a program a long time ago, this was in the 80s or 90s, where the workers were actually being trained in how to fix a 1960s Volkswagen engine. It had no value whatsoever in the labor market as it spoke. So I do think they were poorly designed. And there are retraining programs, but there's also a basic fact about economics. And this is something that shows up repeatedly. If you take a 45 or 50-year-old steel worker or factory worker who's very trained in a very specific skill, and you ask that person to retrain, the incentives are very low. They have a limited horizon over their horizon. So this is one of the fundamental tenets of human capital theory, that the horizon is small. You're not going to capture the benefits. So the incentives to participate in those programs is very low. So for example, we had one of the local institutions retrained its workforce. It started having a new IT system. And it offered all of its workers the opportunity to be retrained on the new technology. And so it was a very interesting age gradient. Younger workers took the training because they were going to be with the company for a long time. The older workers refused. They took their payment, they went, and it makes perfect sense. So I think the way that training programs were designed originally in the 60s, and even today, have not been that sensitive to the incentives that people face in the market for this kind of training they would get, and for the adaptability of a lot of workers to the new training. I mean, there's a sense you can't train, you can't teach old dogs new tricks. You can, but more slowly. And a lot of old dogs just don't want to take the training, period, whether they could be trained or not.
Right, the present value of the future income stream.
Exactly, too small, too limited.
So it actually leads to what would be a politically unpalatable for many people result of you're efficiently unemployed at a certain age once it doesn't make sense for the future income stream to be worth retraining.
It is.
So are these put in place for political reasons then, rather than their actual effect on success?
Well, there's been an eternal hope. I think these programs went on to a big scale in the 1960s. During the war on poverty, during this whole launch under Johnson in the late 60s, or in the early 60s, really starting in 63, 64. And it's very popular, and many people today are still, in the Senate and the House, are very committed to these, because it is popular. You're saying, here's hope, we can train these people. It's very easy to say, we shut the factory down, we'll retrain them, and then nobody follows up with the fact that the training didn't take and so forth. I mean, there's a very non-trivial question that shows up. There's an old book that Edmund Phelps wrote. He's my colleague at Columbia when I was there. And Phelps, and I wrote an essay in this book too, but this book was whether or not when you had workers whose productivity was below what the marginal, what was really profitable to employ in a labor market, whether or not there might be wage subsidies, whether or not you should have something like an earned income tax credit. So there was a non-trivial thing. Should you train them or should you give them subsidy to work? The argument being, well, if you gave them welfare and you sort of isolated them from the larger population, you kind of removed them from the larger society, you created an enclave and you brought people, they weren't participating anymore. And when we tried those programs, that didn't work at all. And so the argument has been made, something like the earned income tax credit or some version of a wage subsidy would say, take individuals whose productivity doesn't warrant a full wage, and subsidize that wage in such a way. I'm not saying this is a perfect program. There's a lot of room for fraud and so forth, but at least give some dignity and gets people attached to the workforce in a way that welfare programs would not. And training programs for the older workers, we could offer them. Sure, there are some very bright, very flexible older people who might want to take these programs and benefit. But I think also we might want to have a richer menu and recognize the incentives that people face in the market and what the empirical record is on a lot of these programs.
Yeah, so actually, let me follow up on that. When we say programs available for them, do we need government programs for this? For the older workers who would be efficient to retrain, don't they have the right incentive, and we have capital markets where they could go pursue retraining or education?
Well, you could, but the argument is usually made for those workers that somehow there's a credit market constraint. They may be having a family, say somebody like who's, say somebody who's laid off, maybe he's in the mid-40s, has a family, a couple of young kids and so forth, and a lot of demands that are associated. And we think there are a lot of people in the U.S. living hand to mouth. We do know that. That's a fact, that there are a lot of people living paycheck to paycheck. And so the question will be, where do you finance those? So yes, you could do that, but then you'd have to think about more creative ways to finance, create financing and provide long-term credit, or credit anyway, that would be paid back. But it should be. If it's efficient to do it, you could do that. But in some cases, it's not efficient. It really isn't. And in some cases, these workers might be better off out of the workforce, given their productivity and given the way the workforce is configured. And then the question is, now you have, some people would say, many people would say, there's a kind of requirement for a social minimum. You don't want people to starve to death. You don't want to treat people with no dignity whatsoever. And what's the best way to do it? And I think training might be one option with loans and I get to borrow, but there'd be a lot of people who simply wouldn't be that trainable. And then there'd be others who might be trainable but couldn't really afford to do this, given the immediate pressure of their lives and their families. So there's a couple of issues to think about. So when you think about these human capital policies, most people think about schools, go to educate. It's not all schools. We're thinking about credit markets. We're thinking about getting firms engaged in an active way. We're thinking about providing information, too, for the workers about what's feasible. So I think we need more flexible thinking. But we're kind of frozen into this mold that was created 60 years ago in the war on poverty. And we still have a lot of warriors in the war on poverty still warring on that, and still claiming success and hoping that this will work again if we only do it at a slightly different scale.
And a lot of your work is also emphasizing that the problem is better solved earlier. So you've done a lot of work on return on investment in human capital across the age spectrum.
Correct.
So can you tell us a little bit about early childhood human capital and how that matters for long-term success, and maybe is done well or could be better done for some groups?
Well, I'll start by telling a personal story. I've been doing a lot of these work on job training programs, and I was very discouraged by what I found. I thought there'd be a hope that these job training programs could really elevate people in a wide scale. And I kept finding very negative results, and I wasn't alone in finding these negative results. So I think an honest assessment of these programs, there are some people who claim otherwise, but if you get to an honest discussion, honest empirical discussion, you won't find strong defenders. But then what I realized is that a lot of these programs were targeted, and the same thing would be true of programs that were targeted towards providing tuition for low-income people. That's been a very popular program. So one of my advisors at Princeton, Bowman, who was president of Princeton later, he was provost and he was advising me. But these had the president of Harvard and people, very common, very good virtue signaling to say we should have lots of low tuition and so. But the trouble is that they view that the price of college at the age of 18 or 19 is a major determinant of whether people go to college. And what was turned out to be the case, two factors were really relevant about why there was low participation in college. One was, of course, information. There really were a bunch of government programs that were not actually accessible. It turns out there was a lot of government programs providing insurance, providing tuition, scholarships, and so forth. And there was a lot of red tape associated with that. So that was one issue. But the other deeper issue, I thought, was the fact that by the time these kids were 16, 17, and 18, they really didn't have a lot of social and what we call human capital, and a variety of skills, motivations, what I call character skills, and things having to do with effort, energy, desire, hope, this ambition, and then providing a sense of verbal fluency. So if you now look, for example, at the test scores, I have a problem with test scores, but let's keep looking at the test score data, you'll see that if you look at the average public school system in the United States now, in big city schools anyway, that the number of people, I mean, like for example in Chicago, the city where I live, there are a number of high schools where 0% of the students are at national reading or levels or mathematics levels. And so all early on in life, they're lacking skills. And then when you think about that and the way that skills develop, see, this is a notion that many people thought about these skills, character skills, personality skills, even thinking about how you control your own life through planning and thinking more forward. Many people think of those as fixed traits, but they're not. They actually are very, very malleable. And they turn out to be more and more malleable at earlier ages. And so what I gradually became aware of was a growing literature and participated in. I've in the last 20 years been doing a lot of work on this literature and extending it in various ways. But finding that the early years, I mean, if you look at the neuroscience and you look at the brain development of these young kids, early years are years of tremendous brain development. So it's like use it or lose it. And if you don't really cultivate it, that these skills, like skills beget skills, and when you provide a framework and a base skill, it's like a tree, it's like any kind of crop you would grow. You provide a good base for it, then it starts to flourish. And if you start trying to remediate these at 16 and 17 with a job training program or a tuition fellowship, it could be too late. So what you can do is more economically efficient to address these questions earlier. I'm not saying we know exactly how to do it, and that links me in part back to the question of the family. Part of the problem is the way the American family has changed over the last 60, 70 years. But also part of it is the fact that the programs are targeted way too late. You're expecting a group of people who haven't received very good education, not much encouragement from home, not much and really a bad skill and character base to really participate in these programs at a later stage. And it may be too late. I'm not saying it's too late, but it's much more efficient to do it earlier. And so there really is a sense, if you read the studies on child development, you'll see a lot of studies that will show about how many synapses are formed when children are young. I mean, that's a dangerous literature. You get this notion that it's all over by age 3 or age 5, and it is not. It is definitely not for anybody here.
Keep working in class, guys.
Well, I will warn you, though, that abstract IQ, not the learned, not memory and so forth, but it seems to peak out at age 18 or 19. So you're near your peak, so take advantage of it. So don't drink too much. But seriously, I think the question, though, is we've come to understand much better these character skills and then aspects that we think of. And this is something that's very non-standard. In some ways, it's not in Chicago, but it's typical. There's a real issue. We've been debating this issue ourselves about the question of how character and ideas are formed. I mean, this is not a plan of social control or trying to form human beings, but we're trying to give people the options to try different selves, to try different options, to give people the maximum flexibility. And it turns out the younger people can engage a lot more actively, and they can learn a lot more. And there's something called dynamic complementarity, which we didn't really appreciate. The dynamic complementarity is how skills propagate skills. The earlier skills, it's like a tree or something. And if you go back, some of you may have read a model by Wicksell, the tree cutting problem. There's a famous problem in capital theory about when should you cut a tree. So you have this harvest of a tree, and you can say, well, look, I have a certain money tied up in a tree, but the tree is growing at a certain rate, and its market value is growing at a certain rate, but then there's the interest rate. And so what you do is, the Wicksell solution was when the rate of growth of the tree is the interest rate, you cut the tree. It's not quite that simple with people, but there is a sense that early years, they do cross-fertilize. They do cross-fertilize. And you really do find that there is a dynamic complementarity where early skills foster later skills. And so so we've done this. I just published a paper in China, just in the latest issue of the Journal of Political Economy. But if you look at it, you'll see some very interesting findings. These are very young children. And it's a program that the Chinese government provided, and it was not a government program in the usual sense. It was basically just advice to parents. And the parents did it. It was the parents who were doing the work. They were just getting the advice. And you can see that earlier the parents, in the life of the child, when the parents got the advice, the more skills the children had later on. And they learned at a faster rate. So that's the notion of skill begets skill, and you get a dynamics there, which I don't think was appreciated back in the era when Johnson and was launching the war on poverty, and all the early programs were put in place. So I do think we have there's a long memory there. People are still, so Patty Murray from Washington is still in favor of Job Corps. Job Corps has a zero return, zero, and it's been known to have a zero return. Experiments now show that, long-term experiments. But the point is that, so there's a vested political interest for these groups and a lot of advocacy, and I'm not going to go on about it. But I think from the point of view of understanding the development of skills, we have a much better understanding. And learning the dynamics, and also understanding things like the emotional basis of reason. So it's not just a matter of having people prove the Pythagorean theorem on Blackboard. A lot of it is basically just learning and encouraging and especially engaging the family in the life of the child. So I come back to the family. And that's where we've really detached everything. It's so politically sensitive, you can't talk about the family.
So this is great. Let me ask you, because I'm sure a lot of people had in mind when you're saying earlier investment in human capital, like earlier education, formal education.
I'm talking about 3 months and 6 months. I'm talking very early in the life of the child. You build on it. It's cumulative. You keep encouraging the child.
In what margins, because people will think about formal education, but you also have done work on returns to athletics, participation in athletics.
Correct, yes.
Which, of course, we can look at at collegiate, high school, but also could go way down to little young children.
Exactly.
What can you tell us about your work on the economic benefits of scholastic athletics?
No, we did study that. We had there were two national studies.
Which, by the way, guys, you went to the basketball game at Texas Tech last night.
It was good. But no, what we did is we looked at 2 longitudinal studies. We could follow kids. We couldn't go back to age 3, so sorry about that. But kids studied like 8th grade, high school, college. And we could see the benefits that accrue. And it's not me alone. There are many, Adele Diamond, and there are many, many scholars working on these questions. But what you see is a strong economic return. So when people were arguing, for example, there's a long discussion, Kavanaugh in his discussion in the Supreme Court was arguing, that these people were exploited completely. Well, you might want to argue they might get a payment. I'm not arguing that case one way or the other. Well, if you just look at the ordinary person who participated in intercollegiate athletes, but also even in interscholastic athletes, within the school, there were some economic benefits. And what people do is they measure something that psychologists call executive function. And what's executive function? Part of it's self-control, working with others. There's a psychologist at the University of British Columbia named Adele Diamond. She's a world expert on this thing called executive function. It involves really partly self-control and the ability to be able to function and to execute problems and then there are other dimensions like working with others and cooperating. And you can see enormous benefits. She studies the benefits of this on executive function. So she studies even tennis, what the benefits are of playing tennis. And this is at the level of school children and children in college and then athletes and professional. And so you actually will see not only the physiological benefits, which do have bigger benefits, by the way. When you're engaged in physical activity and you're engaged in, sweating at the gym and walking and having a decent life in that way, you also are stimulating the brain. The brain is far more active. Learning actually is more engaged. People who actually have healthy bodies. So health is a major component of really fitness, and not only that, but of intellectual growth. So that's what we've come to understand as deeper elements of human. So I think what's happened, this is partly an academic problem in substance, because academics like to kind of put things in boxes and professionalize. And so far, most of the discussion is looking at education and looking at formal education and thinking that education is really taking kids, getting baby Einstein classes or going to the board and doing something, proving the Pythagorean theorem or whatever. And that's not the education. The education is far more And the early work, Aristotle, and many, many thinkers, not just economists for sure, for many generations, Plato, people knew this, maybe for the good or for the bad, but there were people who recognized the value of these early lessons and so forth. So, you know, the Jesuits had this image, you know, give me a man, give me the boy and I will give you the man, or something like that. And there are various mottos of that sort. And so what it really is that we really come to understand that we're building. So the person who, building character. And so what schools are doing. So there's a very famous, what's his name? The guy who invented who's the American scholar who invented the common school? He was from Massachusetts.
Horseman.
Horseman, yeah. He wrote a book. He wrote in one of his reports to the Department of Education in Massachusetts in the 1840s. He said, you know, reading and writing and arithmetic is the least of what we teach in school. And he was right, because you were teaching a whole set of character. I don't know how many of you have actually read Aesop's Fables, but that's what's taught. Have you ever read McGuffey's Reader? Have you looked at that recently?
No.
But that was the
I'm getting
standard
worried that he's
text.
going to start asking me questions.
No, but if you read McGuffey's Reader, you'll find it interesting. They're tales of morality. People didn't like it too much because a lot of it was kind of Protestant, Bible-oriented, and so when Catholics came, they didn't want to see the Protestant lessons, and then there were other groups, Jews and other minority groups came in. This is viewed, and then finally we got the notion that no religion at all should be taught. But these lessons, the Aesop Fables lessons, were lessons that were really morality lessons, and they were just as much on the agenda as reading, writing, and arithmetic. And they were character building lessons, working with each other and so forth. So that's kind of been viewed as off limits. So we reached a stage now. See, in the 1960s, we reached the level what many people thought was the high point of education and scientific research and learning, and that was cognitive psychology. So we thought the be-all and end-all of a person was the IQ, how smart you were. What do you think is the percentage of the variance of lifetime earnings, discounted lifetime earnings, explained by IQ? Just the variability among people. So if I know your IQ score, you know, what would be the variability that I would predict with that in a regression of some sort? What would you guess?
25%.
I was gonna go about 40 to 50.
I'd say it's more like 4 to 5. Wow. No, when you find these other things, these character skills, and you look at things that we're confused with IQ, executive functioning. Think of what executive functioning is. We have a whole theory. There we have people who are emerging from adolescence, so I'll give you Steinberg's theory of adolescence, but literally with the developing brain, what you see is, first of all, the pleasure centers are emerging earlier and self-control later. That's connected with the prefrontal cortex. That's already made its way into the law. You know, we don't execute people who are too young. Their brain is not fully developed. But the fact of the matter is, it's self-control in this whole process of regulatory behavior. So Steinberg has this great line in his book. He's an adolescent psychologist, and I think it's really highly relevant. What's the period in your life when you remember the most pleasurable memories? Here, what's yours?
I'm having a great time today.
Oh no, but he would argue it's the early teenage years, and that's when you're developing these pleasure centers without that self-control inhibiting you. And that literally is a physiological process that can be developed, and it can be nurtured, it can be cultivated, and not in a controlled way. So it's not like we're trying to make people members of the Hitler Youth or Stalin Youth or whatever it's called. But I think what we're trying to do is give them the regulatory skills so they can choose to be what they want to be. It's a matter of choice. See, I see this as a question of, you know, Amartya Sen talks about capability theory. He goes way off into a whole set of political dimensions if he likes. But I think there's an element of truth to it if you keep it to the skills and the ability to regulate. So if you give somebody the ability to achieve, to do things, it's their right to decide where they want to use those skills. That should be used. We want to give it to them, that choice. And that's what I think is going on. We don't think of education that way. When we're looking at NAEP scores, it's amazing. It's amazing. OECD, which is this PISA score generator, it creates these test scores. And you'll see stories, you know, that the kids in Shanghai have the highest, or at least they used to have the highest PISA scores. And these are achievement test scores. A little bit like the SAT or something like an Iowa test. But it turned out that's only a small fraction of what's going on with the structure of achievement. And these regulatory skills, motivation, and the ability, and resilience. So there's a whole discussion too about creativity. How do we teach creativity? It's a big issue in China. Chinese education has typically been very, very, very much rote memorization historically. But it's also true in the US. So how do we teach people? And we teach people through play, through all kinds of other actions. And executive functioning does give us the ability to imagine things, to look at alternative controls. So it's like we build these counterfactual worlds, we give them to our children, even at age 2 and 3. They start thinking, I'm going to be a doctor, a lawyer, I'm going to be a pilot, something. And those kinds of possibilities open up children, and they give a possibility. And the sooner we expose children to those opportunities, the better. But it's not like we need to get so many words, so much syntax. And that's been the way that a lot of people have focused on education. So these governors' conferences that look at NAEP scores, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, very, very limited. I mean, they are negative. I was using them already and looking at the Chicago schools performing so badly. But the whole US population is not that good at these either. Even the national average, you have a lot of people below national average. But that's only a dimension of what human achievement is. And education has to do that. But the other part of it is integrating the family more closely into the education of the children. And now there's been this separation. So people blame the schools, but not the families. Schools can only do a limited amount, especially when families aren't supporting it. I mean, any school teacher will tell you that, but there's not much that discussion in public policy.
So you've already got into this a little bit, but maybe you could just expand on it more, because you did a whole book on the myth of the achievement test.
Yes, I did.
What is the myth?
Well, it's exactly this idea that these achievement tests, if you go back to the origins, I already mentioned Horace Mann, somebody kindly gave me the prompt, and I appreciate that. But when you look at this, the idea was that these tests are really very definitive and should be used in a regulatory sense. And when the SAT was opened up, it was really an opportunity. People, if you look at the way it's originally used, in the 1910s and 20s, who went to Harvard? It was mostly people whose fathers had gone to Harvard, and so forth and so on. Now, what you see is people in the 30s who started going to Harvard were people who got good SAT scores. So in that sense, it was a real triumph. Smart people who weren't, very well off and were kind of an ice. Like Tobin's father, I think, was working as an athletics director in the athletics department of the University of Illinois. And he was a very smart young man, and he got to Harvard, and he learned a lot and became a prominent economist. And so that was an avenue of social mobility. But then those became very defining, very, very restrictive, because there are other dimensions of success that are extremely important that we don't measure. And what's interesting to look at, and we did look at it in this book, all the original creators of these tests, they all say what I'm saying right now. They all spoke that. They just said we can't measure it very well. But that's where there's been a lot of development going on. We do measure these things better, and we continue to measure them better. And there are new developments being made all this time, even using AI, but also measurements on various kinds, looking at social media posts and so forth. There are assessments of personality. There are newer ways. Some of the neuroscientists are looking at very exciting ways, but looking exactly at brain pathways to measure. So we can think of much more inclusive measurements and thinking of much more positive ways to assess all the rich complexity of who we are. So instead of thinking it's all IQ, so I think cognitive psychology was a disaster. It really was. I'll give you an example that was really great. There was a study done that actually prompted Murray to write the bell curve. And it was a famous study that was done, and I've forgotten the name of but there was a study done in the 1960s. And what was found was that Head Start programs of the 60s were found to have no effect. There was a fade out of IQ, and that was typically what was found. And that was it. The notion was IQ was fading out. You raise the IQ, and a few years later you follow these kids. These are experiments. So you said, oh no, we're not really, you couldn't boost long-term IQ. So books were written, you cannot boost IQ. And Murray has essentially taken that as given. Now, what we have turned out is we can boost IQ. And we've done so by intervening and providing richer family and encouraging environments. So IQ has been boosted. There was a study done in North Carolina some 40 years ago now. And these kids are now in their late 40s. We follow them into their 40s, the IQs go up. But we can also see that a lot of the benefits of these programs and these interventions came through these social and emotional skills. They can control their lives. So one of the most startling findings from this study, here was a program designed to boost IQ, okay? And the idea was, well, you know, we should, IQ can't be boosted, was the idea. But we can follow these programs and we see, oh, what are the other benefits? We look at these social and emotional skills and even look at health. The health wasn't on the table. These are basically interventions that were promoting parent-child interactions. They were actually, in the end, always the most beneficial effects came operating through the way parents were dealing with their children. It was the parents dealing with their children. It wasn't the program per se. It was the fact that parents were responding to these energized, galvanized children. And so what came out, we had a paper in Science 10 years ago now, and it was showing there were strong benefits in terms of things like metabolic syndrome, a precursor for diabetes. You looked at not just metabolic syndrome, but looked at things like blood pressure readings, looked at a number of health indicators. There were strong medical benefits that came out of this program. It had no medical component. There was no design in that way. You say, how can that be? And that's because we typically think about these programs as targeting one thing at a time, and we don't see the value of this larger set of child-family interactions.
So that's actually a great segue to go to the much larger picture here.
Right.
And maybe think about the global environment of poverty reduction. So you've been in Chicago since 1973.
Yes.
From then till now has seen by far the largest reduction in abject poverty in world history in sheer
Yes.
numbers. It's also been an age, at least from the early 1980s through the most of the 2000s, of a great liberalization. What role do you see for the spread of freedom and free enterprise around the world compared to what it had been at the start of your career in global poverty reduction?
Well, there have been episodes in this. I mean, periods when, in the 1960s and 70s, I mean, look, in the 1960s, Kennedy, when he was president, was actually implemented a very big tax cut in the early 60s. And he saw that there were strong disincentives. And when it was studied, there were follow-ups of the study in the early 60s. That's part of the reason why I got into economics in the first place. It looked like we knew what we were doing. But in this case, later learned not so much. But the point is that you could see that the high taxation and regulation was very negative. And so we thought we learned that lesson. And then this happened, and there was a period in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of gradual liberalization. You know, Carter himself was actually doing a lot of reforms in terms of air traffic, and so there was a growing awareness, and Clinton was also very aware of this. So I think there was this period. And now we see, in Reagan, of course, but what happened was now we seem to be moving into a new era where all those lessons have been lost. And we're blaming the growth in poverty on China, we're blaming it on things that aren't really relevant, I don't think. I mean, this whole notion about the China shock, I don't know how many of you believe in the China shock, and I'll tell you the truth about the China shock. I had a Wall Street Journal editorial about this a few months ago, but Han Mingfeng at Penn. But literally the China shock of Otter and Dorn, which has gotten a lot of attention, is just not, it's true that certain industries were hit by the China shock. There were no questions. That industries that compete directly with goods that get produced more cheaply in China, they were impacted. And those older workers especially, who had very specific skills and working in those industries, couldn't migrate easily, they weren't able to adjust, and so they suffered real losses, no denying. But on the other hand, what was never counted, and we are now counting it much better, is the welfare gain, the Walmart effect, if people call it that. And the fact is that cheap Chinese goods, some of them were consumer goods, others were goods that were used for intermediate inputs. We studied this more consistently now, and we see real benefits from this trade. And so that's not counted in the China shock. And some of the other dimensions about the fact that we are, are distorting in some sense. So there, in the end, there was net job creation, but there were people lost. There were jobs lost. But the way it's characterized now all these welfare gains are completely distorted. They're not mentioned, they're not counted. But there is a real Walmart effect. If you look at the price of goods, back in the 70s and 80s, of what would be a common basket of consumer. Same thing was true. McCurdy had this nice study years ago in reverse effect. He was looking at minimum wage effects. So Card has this study claiming minimum wages have no effect. It's highly cited, by the way. It's very widely cited. There's a study of fast food joints on one side of the Delaware River and the other side in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And they introduced the minimum wage laws on one side. They saw no effects. However, they didn't take into account a lot of basic economics. And what McCurdy did, and his student, had a very nice paper. So what was the consequence? Well, when you get a higher price of labor, how do you do it? One thing you can do is go out of business, but that's going to be a long-run effect. You're not going to find that in the data, not the kind of data Card was analyzing. You're probably not going to make new investments in those industries, but that was not counted. It was never discussed. But one thing you do is you raise the price of the good. And that's what happened. In the fast food markets where the minimum wage increased, the price of McDonald's went up, where the labor price went up. And who was eating McDonald's? It tended to be lower income people. So the very people who were argued to be the target of these welfare gains, the minimum wage gains, were the ones who were suffering the most. And that's a version of the Walmart effect in reverse. Right. In some sense, what we're doing is saying, we get these gains, we can't, in an economic discussion, I don't know, maybe we failed as economists to educate people more generally, but there are these gains. And then there's a whole series of papers now looking at intermediate inputs. So you get cheaper steel or cheaper plastics or cheaper, and then you could use that to build industries in the United States, and there was growth in that dimension.
And when it comes to the jobs lost from the China shock, this isn't an unfortunate byproduct. This is part and parcel of the case for trade.
Right.
We have to change what we're doing, which means reallocating capital and labor to get the gains. Otherwise, we don't get it.
Exactly, and if we flexibly respond, that would be the way. Now, this would be a case, going back to the question about what do you do with unemployed people. It's a case that if you have a glass blower working in Ohio, who's now very skilled, but the Chinese glass is much cheaper, and that person's been doing this glass blowing his whole life, then retraining him to be, a welder or something isn't probably so there's a case where you have to argue, do you want to subsidize that? That's a human dignity case. That's a case, do we want to attach that person into the workforce or give welfare? And some people would argue against welfare just on the grounds of social isolation. There's a whole discussion there. But I do think, we want to think more broadly about these benefits, for sure.
Well, we've been talking for about 45 to 50 minutes now. I bet you there's some other people in the audience who would like to ask you questions as well. So I will stop here. Amanda has a microphone. Are there people in the audience who would like to ask some questions?
Or disagree. It's even better to disagree.
We have one right here, Amanda.
My name is Stacey. I'm not anything in psychology, but my mother, she's a therapist and she works mostly with children, children who have trauma. And it's really interesting, a lot of the stuff you mentioned about how important the family is and sort of the impacts on your brain from a young age. Because that's something my mom will argue and things that she sees in her work that, she's kind of some issues with the private schools. It's, it's only education and everything. And her experience of the difference comes from the family. And one of the big things she talks about is dysregulation. So you have a lot of children that come from houses or homes, there may be violence, there may be abuse, or don't have that sort of structure. And so they'll go to school and they kind of act out as a way to gain control back over situations. I don't know, for example, when I'm going to be hit, so I'm going to go ahead and cause the situation to happen.
Right.
And another thing too is like childhood trauma. A lot of people don't really realize like how impactful that is. We kind of think of kids as very resilient, and they are to some degree, but not as much as you would think. Like there was a study done where they were having like kind of a group of people on a weight loss program, and they were like, why are some of these people, they just can't seem to, they keep relapsing, and then they kind of wanted to look deeper into these people's lives, and they realized a good chunk of these folks had sexual abuse that they had encountered as children. And that kind of became one of the first, like, oh, there's this connection here. So I think that's a really good point, kind of, you come from the economic side, but from a
Well,
mom's
there's a study
perspective,
done
yeah.
by a psychologist in California on Kaiser Permanente. He's been looking at a large group of these people. It's got some issues, so I don't want to go too far with it, but it really is showing the importance of early childhood abuse and coming up with scales. I mean, that's a non-trivial problem, and that's the general problem which nobody wants to talk about in the U.S., which is the way family life has changed. And for a lot of kids, the advantages are not there. There are real advantages. I mean, some people have suggested we should get rid of all the advantages and take away parents from, California was doing that in the 1980s, right? That's how the schools managed to sink to such a low level there. As a result, the parents were able to supplement what was going on at school. That was forbidden, and now everybody was treated equally and badly, I should also point out. But I do think engaging the family in a constructive way. But it's non-trivial. I mean, it's easier said than done. And I recognize there are abusive families. I mean, this work by, what's his name, Vincent Folletti has this early abuse index. And if you look at this, that is a very powerful predictor of later life outcomes. And I think it's, and so we need, again, to target that. It's a small fraction, but there's a study it's a very nice study. There's a couple of people, well, Terry Moffat, I don't know if you know her. Moffat is a psychologist both at UCL in London and in Duke, but she's done this whole study in New Zealand, the Dunedin study, and she has several books. And it's not an experiment, but it's a long-term longitudinal study showing the predictability. And it's really an amazing study, I think, because even though, I mean, it's just looking at how people emerge. It's a very big sample, pretty big sample, and you can just see how various life experiences are mapping into life outcomes. And now she can follow these kids into their 40s and now into their 50s now, I think, the Dunedin study. So those early conditions are very important. We've known them to be important. I mean, Freud wrote about them. A lot of psychologists wrote about them. But you see, in terms of economic policy, when we come to these questions, it's always going back to the school. We say, well, raise teacher pay, or we're going to spend more money on school buildings or something. Not looking at, well, where are the kids' parents? How are we going to engage the parents with the child? And to me, one of the most surprising things was how well, when you look at the successful programs, I have a paper with somebody you should invite here from Texas A&M, my co-author, Garcia, so Jorge Garcia. But Garcia and I have a series of papers, but we have this one paper where we looked at a variety of successful programs. And the recurring theme was the improved parent-child interactions. And in whatever mechanism it is, it doesn't have to be a government program, not at all. But it has to be in some ways to encourage family in the life of the child. And that is sometimes discouraged or not recognized as how important it is. And I think it is a public policy focus. But the truth of the matter is, in the US, when we start talking about the family, we start getting into hot water. You know, Nixon, when he was president, was planning, I think there was a program that, who was it? It was the senator from Mondale had introduced an early child care program, a version of Head Start on a national scale. And it was passed by the Senate and the House. And Nixon was president, it was like 69 or 70, long before Nixon got into any of the problems he got into later. And Nixon vetoed it. And he vetoed it because he didn't want the government intervening with the family. And I think that's a legitimate point. But these programs that I'm describing are not intervening. It's not like a program of teaching the kid to worship, Chairman Mao or Chairman Donald or anybody. It's something what you're trying to do is teach basic skills and teach this value of interaction and support. And so there's a principle that psychologists have developed long ago. It was a Russian psychologist, Vygotsky. And this idea is basically what he calls this notion. The notion is basically trying to develop the child and recognize the position of where the child's at. So a kind of personalized education, a Vygotsky program. Now I think we're getting in a much better position of being able to monitor where the child is at. Actually, one program I'm looking at, I'll just kind of keep going here, but I'll make one last.
Let's try and not let you.
I know, I'm going to overrule you here, but, no, but one thing we're doing is actually I'm working with some people in Shenzhen in China, and we built some robots. And these robots are working with children. These robots have an LLM, and the robots are actually very friendly. If you look at them, they're very friendly. Kids love the robots. But you can also monitor. You can look at measures of not only speech and language and various kinds of things, but also aspects of personality and so forth. So we're getting much better ways to think about personalizing education, just like medicine. Much more personalized medicine. So we're moving in that direction where, I'm not saying we've reached it, but we're moving in that direction where you can personalize education. And then you could keep records. And you could then do things that are much easier. That would then be what's called, I got to use the term scaffolding, that was the term. It was something like building. It was a little like building a sculpture where where next, where do you put the nose? And you only put the nose when you have the proper face to put the nose on and so forth and so on. And so the analogy with children is the same, but you need to know where the child's at. And I think we're developing. I think this is exciting where we can actually develop it. So we have a whole project in Shenzhen, so I'm working in China now. I may have turned code, but I'm working with a group of people who are very good at robotics and computing. So,
All right. Do we have another question? From another person? There we go, right here. JP.
yes.
Hey, so I was wondering what would be your thoughts on the whole role of social media nowadays with children? Like, I'm sure you're familiar with like Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, that criticizes a lot the role of social media and like smartphones and all the technology in child development. Do you attribute a lot of that with the decline in child social skills in recent?
Well, what I was talking about earlier was going back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, and I don't think we can blame social media for that. I think we can blame more generally the social influences, but the family starts to play a really big role in this. And it's not just social media in the sense of height, it's also even in the use of AI. I mean, we do see, in terms of learning, too much reliance, and that's been studied. I was interested in a conference in Beijing where we had cognitive scientists from around the world, and I was invited as an economist. It was a very well-developed conference, good people developing, looking at human development in various dimensions. And again, social media, AI, but when people were using this to write essays, of course, that's not going to develop skills. But more generally, I mean, this is also true for some of the older people. If you start using Google and you don't test your memory is going to slide, no question about it. So even though I stumbled on Horace Mann, I think I would wait Horace Mann before I went to Google. But I do think we do see elements of that. We do see negative elements. And this is earlier work too. So Haidt has done this, but there are many other psychologists who've actually studied some adverse effects of media. But some of it is isolation. Some of it is just pure isolation. Especially, I mean, I found it amazing in Japan, there's this group of kids, and we call them insults now in the US, right? These guys who are completely isolated, young men, staying at home, playing games. And there's some people who wear diapers, right, while they're playing their games. They don't want to break their flow in the game. They're so addicted to the game. And there is really addiction. I guess we're going to have hearings on this right now, right? About the addiction of social media and so forth. I don't know whether I'm going to go anywhere. But there is an addictive quality. And it does displace what would be sort of natural thought processes. And in the case of the insults, where people are really being displaced completely from social, see, that's the other part that we don't think about so much. When we think about learning, we think of it as a solitary aspect. I'm teaching a child a lesson. Maybe the mother and the father are teaching the child. But there's also this larger language, this larger group, I should say, where people are actually, it's those social interactions that play a very powerful role. And we tend to minimize those. There's been some recent discussions, about suggesting moving people to one neighborhood or another. I don't think those studies are so good. But put that to the side. The fact is, there's an element of choice here. And the fact is that these children with whom they interact, peers do play a big role. And we need to recognize that, and schools need to recognize that. And so there's been a lot of discussion, but that's a challenge to modern economic theory too, is to really build social interactions in. We talk about, Aristotle was, of course, said we're social animals, so this is not a new idea. But measuring it, when you think about educational policy, people have talked about busing, and the results on busing have been pretty mixed, I'm afraid to say, from what I've seen. And I mentioned, or to some earlier today, about a study that was done in Denmark about busing immigrants. These are Assyrian immigrants from the ghettos in Copenhagen out to the outlying Jutland schools. And those are disasters because they were not socially accepted by the peers. But I think we need to think much more broadly about how we build peer influence and even build them. See, there's been a lot of discussion again, movement back and forth. I don't know quite I'm not in an education school. I'm really kind of glad. But what I'm saying is that there have been at some time notion that we needed to have a lot of peer group. We needed to foster children who are very bright. So, and there were these subsidies given and programs devised that encourage bright children. But now that's being heavily discouraged, like the new mayor of New York City. He wants to break up Bronx School of Science and Stuyvesant and all those high-achieving schools because they're not fair. And the argument is, well, the kids who get into them have an advantage. And they do. A lot of those are the parents who actually stay with the kids, who encourage the kids. And so there is an advantage. But is the right policy to break it up? No, because you're actually building on the capital. The real thing is those earlier, I think, to try to build the base so those kids can take advantage of those. See, that's the whole idea of dynamic complementarity. So we need to think more broadly about these educational policies and the dynamics of skill growth and the interrelatedness, not only of solitary learning, but peer learning and engagement. So I think that there's a lot of room to engage, but the traditional model of the classroom with the teacher, I mean, that's okay. I mean, it's great. It was a great breakthrough 100 years ago, maybe, but it's not good now. Not good to stop there anyway. And so I think that's part of the answer.
Professor Heckman, it's been an honor to host you here tonight. Thank you so much for interacting with all of us.